Welcome to the Saving Stormwater podcast. Before we get started, I want to thank Compliance Go for making this podcast possible. With everyone practicing social distancing, it can be hard to make sure you're following all the proper guidelines for environmental compliance. With Compliance Go, your users can maintain environmental inspections, document changes, and manage their team all from their favorite browser. For our podcast listeners, you can manage your stormwater inspections with a facility, project, or asset free for life. Make sure to check out the link in the podcast description. All right, ladies and gentlemen, for the Saving Stormwater podcast today, I am joined by Dan. Dan, I realized right as we're getting to this point, I have never said your last name out loud, and I didn't want the podcast to be the first time I said it, so I'm going to let you do that.
All right, well, it's Nedvidek.
Nedvidek.
There you go. I was kind of curious. I was going to let you go for it and see what happened.
Okay. Well, Dan, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Tell us a little bit about your work experience and how you're saving stormwater.
No problem, Preston. Thanks for having me. This is a nice break from kind of the work from home monotony. So I've been in and out of environmental consulting for about 10 years now. I have both of my undergraduate and graduate degree from Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And my graduate program focused on municipal separate stormwater systems and looking at their compliance programs and how they can ramp those up and actually use technology and social media to influence public opinion of their programs and to get more public participation in programs as well. So I've done things like IDDE inspections. I've done statewide on-foot surveys of stormwater infrastructure along state highways. I've put in water quality monitoring systems in caves underneath cities that use these cave systems for stormwater disposal and treatment. And I've done a lot of work with industrial facilities as well, including spending about a year and a half as a compliance manager for an aluminum facility with an associated landfill. So lots of stormwater from a couple different sectors. It's a topic I enjoy, and it's something I try to stay in touch with no matter where I'm working.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we ever talked about this before or even talked about wanting to address it on the podcast, but stormwater management with caves, that sounds interesting. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So Bowling Green, Kentucky is built on top of a big cave system and is about 40 miles from Mammoth Cave. So when the city was getting going, like late 1800s, bedrock is really shallow throughout most of the city, like some areas 3 to 5 feet. So it's really hard to put in subsurface infrastructure. So the city started drilling these wells, stormwater injection wells. And they essentially built a lot of the downtown and a lot of the city on the fact that these wells could get rid of stormwater very easily. The city's drinking water intake and the Barren River, kind of the eventual receptor for all this, is about a mile away from downtown. So you can kind of guess that it caused some problems later on down the road. But Bowling Green's a city of, I think, 60 to 70,000 people right now. And when we were doing our updated study in 2014, I think we came out to about 3,500 stormwater injection wells within the city boundaries. So these were used when they're putting in new developments. They're used in industrial areas. They're used in agricultural areas. They're all over the city. And they're starting to get a better handle on it now, but essentially they were using the cave system to transport stormwater because it was too expensive to put in traditional infrastructure.
So is that unique to just Kentucky, or 'cause I've never heard of anything even remotely similar?
Not necessarily Kentucky, but anywhere in a karst area, a city with a cave system around it has probably used that cave system for either stormwater or sewage disposal at some point in its history.
Huh. I have more questions about that, but that's kind of off topic for what we were going to discuss today. So hopefully we can Yeah, all right. Well, we'll definitely come back to that at some point. I'd love to have you on for another episode just to talk about that. But in the meantime, everybody's mind is kind of focused on the coronavirus right now, and especially with environmental compliance, it involves a lot of direct interaction with people quite frequently, very close quarters sometimes too. And so, with everyone distancing themselves from one another, what are some ways that we can still encourage stormwater compliance and still maintain stormwater management?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that not everything is going to be business as usual for quite a while, but that doesn't mean you need to stop doing what you're doing. And there are ways that you can still maintain compliance um, with respect to some of these social distancing guidelines and the shelter in place guidelines. Um, it's a great time to bring technology into your compliance program, whether it's through something like Compliance Go offers or it's doing what we're doing now using Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever, to stay in contact with your site managers, with your clients, with your regulators. There are ways to communicate and to engage people that don't involve sitting in the same room with them.
Hmm. So that's a that's a good kind of lead into my next question, which is rather than us focusing on those things we can't do, like being right next to each other and having a conversation about what's happening with our BMPs or whatever, what are some things that we should continue to do?
Right now, what we're doing and what I think a lot of people are doing is taking a little bit of time to review your internal programs. So, making sure that your training documentation, your compliance tracking systems, your scheduling, whatever you've got a little bit of downtime now probably where you're not rushing. You're probably not chasing storm events. Maybe your inspection schedule is slowed down or construction is slowed down a little bit. So take some time and make sure your house is in order. So, I like to think of it, if you had to leave work for 3 weeks for vacation, illness, absence, whatever, could any of your colleagues get into your files, look at your schedule and say, okay, I know what Dan was doing and I can handle this for a couple of weeks because he's got everything laid out. Uh,
Hmm.
and I know that in this industry, especially if you're doing construction inspection and maintenance, it's really easy to fall behind on that kind of thing because you're getting called out. You're going to, it rained an inch and a half in a day somewhere, and everyone, somebody's 100 yards of silt fence is blown out and there's mud all over a road or something. You've got a lot going on, and the paperwork sometimes suffers because of that. But that's really the foundation of compliance is your documentation. So you've got some
Hmm.
time, use it wisely, and make sure everything's in order.
That's a good point. So, in trying to maintain that documentation and communications, obviously a big part of that. What are some ways that your team has been making adaptations to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic?
Well, I kind of mentioned the online communication. I work remotely. Most of my colleagues are in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm in Tallahassee. So
Hmm.
we've already been using a lot of remote work solutions like we're doing now, but making sure that those stay up to date and doing, it's annoying, but daily check-ins, making sure you know what people are doing at all times. If you're on the industry side of this, you're not necessarily worried about keeping your utilization up, but still keeping people busy. If you're on the consulting side of this, you've got field crews that you need to keep busy and you need to keep them utilized. So knowing
Hmm.
what these guys are doing when maybe not everyone's getting the field time that they used to get is super important right now. Again, it's fieldwork intensive. I've got a site in Louisiana that's obviously remote for everyone involved in my company. Our work down there takes about a week at a time, and the facility would like to have us on. And we're looking at something like, all right, can we rent an RV? Honestly, we've got two guys that need to go down there. Can we put them in an RV? We don't want to put them in a hotel. We don't want
Hmm.
to put them out to eat. It's a fairly remote site, but they need to be on site for about a week.
Yeah.
So they're younger, they're adventurous, they're all for it. They think it's going to be this great fun thing to drive an RV from
Yeah.
Tennessee to Louisiana. And I'm not going to shoot their dreams down, but we're looking at kind of some unorthodox ways to get people on site, and we've got to really determine internally if that's safe.
Yeah. That's a good point. Did you guys get an RV? I swear I've seen something on Instagram about some compliance consultants have gotten RVs to do that.
We haven't yet, but it is
Okay.
like it's probably going to happen in the next week.
Interesting. That would be a lot of fun and very adventurous, like you said.
Like your teammates,
Yes.
trust that everyone. That's the thing is everyone's been quarantining, everyone's been safe. You got some concern about asymptotic people that can have this disease and not show it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to find a way to vet that. We don't want to put people, even coworkers, people who are comfortable around each other, in a position where they may cause one another to get sick. So we've got to decide what the appropriate measures are for that. And a lot of that's going to depend on when widespread testing becomes available.
Sure.
And a lot of facilities are kind of in the same boat. They don't want people, even in a remote capacity, to be on site that may have passing contact with security personnel or people who are still at the facility.
Right. So that being said, what do you think are the most important things for us to keep up on?
Stick to your normal schedule if you can. When this ends and everyone goes back to work, whether it's kind of a phased in thing or there's some miracle and everyone gets to go back all at once, you're going to go back to your normal workload plus whatever you haven't been able to do. There's some EPA guidance out there related to compliance, and there's a couple things that they're letting essentially slide for the time being, but you're still going to come back to a massive workload. And if you've gotten into the habit of getting up late or working short days, and it's nobody's fault, but this is a complete change. So try to stick to your normal working schedule because it's going to be super hectic when you get back.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about that. It's been confession time. I am not wearing my normal jeans that I wear to work below the webcam. But I think you're right. It does help to kind of maintain a little bit of a rhythm. I think human beings are just kind of built for rhythm. You know what I mean? So, let's see. So we're going to do a quick change of, a little bit of a change of topic here. I think we've addressed coronavirus pretty well. So now this is kind of the big kahuna on everyone's minds right now, the Waters of the United States rule, and there's a little bit of changes as to definitions. What are your first impressions?
My first impression is this is not going to be the last final Waters of the United States ruling we see over the next few years. The goal is always admirable for the rule, but president to president, it changes. We've seen a lot of shift over the last 10 years with it, and I don't think that this is going to be a set in stone. Here's what you do. I think this is going to be in place for a couple of years. It's going to be challenged pretty quickly in courts. And then I think the next president, whoever it is, may probably make some more changes too. There's just, again, I could do a whole episode on this too. It says, they try to provide, and Congress tries to provide guidance without being too constrictive to the states. Problem is the states don't agree on what should be in the rule, and surface water and groundwater boundaries don't follow state boundaries. So, it's always going to be a mess. I think it's a mess right now, and they're doing what they can, but I don't think we're at a final place for this rule.
Just for viewers who might not know, what are some of the changes? What are some of the definitions? What is the panic situation that everyone's thinking that this means right away?
Well, I think the ephemeral streams and looking at the connection between streams, kind of blanked for a second. The definition of ephemeral streams is probably the biggest change right now. So I think it's something like 51% of wetlands in the United States supply or rely on ephemeral streams for some source of water supply. So on one side of the argument, you've got people saying, all right, you removed this massive protection for wetlands that aren't necessarily directly connected visually to a navigable water body, but are still connected. The science shows they're still connected, but it's really hard to convince people they're connected if you've got an ephemeral stream or something that dries up every other month feeding them. So the difficulty is looking at this in a systematic view, and you've got to define where the parameters of that system are. So I think that's what's throwing a lot of people off right now. On one side, you've got people who are arguing that the initial ruling was way too restrictive, that you were throttling back business and development, that you're adding unnecessary regulatory burdens and timelines and money to most of these projects. And from what I see, the states get a little more say in it right now. The regulatory process has been speeded up, and a big chunk of what used to be regulated just isn't there anymore. So I think there's going to be a balance that'll come eventually. And I don't know where it is. I'm not a lawyer and haven't ever worked for the Corps or done any of this. So, my opinions are my own on it, but.
Yeah, I've got a buddy that I do a private podcast with periodically, and he's a paralegal, and so we did a coronavirus like legal, what is the $1,200 a month figure mean a little while back, and I kept saying like, oh, we're just giving some good advice, and he kept going, no, we are not giving we're not giving any legal advice. We can't say that. And I think we did that like 3 times on there. So for him, this is not legal advice. We're not giving that. We're just kind of speculating here. But do you see any real, I guess, kind of practical day-to-day differences happening for most people, or is it just going to be kind of business as usual for the most part moving forward?
I think for people who are already involved in the industry and who have projects going on, and unless you had something where you were really watching these court cases and watching this ruling come out, it's going to be business as usual for you. For the permitting aspect and some delineation aspects, things are going to change. But honestly, for most industries, I don't see this changing much right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. Do you have any recommendations for stormwater compliance professionals, and what this might mean for them? Do they see this as an opportunity, or is it just kind of business as usual? I don't know.
I'm going to go with business as usual for this. There may be a lot of this would be on the new construction or the utility and infrastructure construction side. There may be a slight change to some permitting language. There may be, I don't know that you're going to see, a speeded up ARAP permit or a water quality certification get speeded up because of this. I haven't done enough of that in the last 2 years to really say, oh, this is going to lift a huge burden off the regulatory community. Mm-hmm. So I think the best thing is just, if you've got regulatory contacts, just stay in touch with them. Talk to your regulators, talk to the certifying officials. There's a lot of good information coming out of the Corps and their different districts right now on how this is going to affect people. There's webinars. Take some time and just try to stay updated and educate yourself as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. Listen to the Saving Stormwater podcast, right?
Absolutely. That would be one way to do it.
Yeah. All right. So kind of the last segment that we had, we kind of threw this one in right towards the end last week when we were going through some of the stuff we wanted to talk about. But I think it's always fun to go through and do a little bit of these because I think we forget sometimes how often stormwater just kind of gets forgotten in the general public, I guess. So stormwater myth busting. We're going to start off with the most common myth that everyone has about storm drains, and that's storm drains go to treatment plants.
No. There are some areas of the country where you've still got combined sewer overflow systems that may, probably still don't even go to any kind of plant unless you've got a consent decree in place. But for the most part, your stormwater goes directly to a receiving stream or a surface water or groundwater system. And if you're an industrial facility, that's listed in your NPDES permit, whether you've got a general statewide industrial permit or you've got a site-specific permit. Some areas now, most of it is like a city and county-wide ordinance. You'll see things like the Filterra curb inlet boxes, sediment removal systems, biofiltration systems, CDS boxes, filtration or jellyfish or one of those systems. So those are treatment devices, but they're very focused on specific things, removing certain metals or knocking down a sediment load, maybe taking nutrients out depending on what part of the country you're in. So it's not a treatment plant like drinking water. But there are some things in place. And if you've got an individual permit, you know what I'm talking about, because you probably have some kind of treatment or settlement clause in there. So you've got to do some work, but for the most part, what you see running down the street during a rainstorm is not treated in any way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so our next stormwater myth is that stormwater pollutants are not typically harmful.
So, like to a kid splashing around in a puddle, probably not. But when you look at cumulative effects, yes. You look at what's coming off your car, what's coming off a construction site, what's coming off, even something as crazy as particulates coming out of industrial smokestacks. If you've ever been to an iron foundry or anything like that, and you notice that all the roofs of all the buildings around it are red, and that's, it's the little bit of metal particulates that come out and oxidize and rust. And you got to think, those go every time there's a storm, they get pushed somewhere. Same thing with sediment off any other site. It's why you maintain your BMPs, why you keep up with this stuff, because it's a cumulative thing. It's not like an acute toxin in the rainwater that's going to hurt you, but over time it clogs up the system or damages other things.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't have said it better myself. So, next myth, stormwater only goes to local streams.
Stormwater goes lots of places, mainly to surface water and groundwater systems. But when you, the way that's presented, it says only goes to local streams. So the question to ask is, all right, where does your local stream go? And your local stream goes probably to your local river or your local lake, which is where your local drinking water intake is probably situated. So yes, stormwater goes to the streams, but it's, think back to elementary school and the water cycle. We don't lose much water. It's all continuously moving through this cycle. So what goes into a small stream eventually makes its way somewhere else, and then you drink it after some point in time.
Mm-hmm. I frequently use Finding Nemo as my golden example, because all drains lead to the ocean, kid, right? So next myth that we got here, stormwater is mainly an urban problem only, and industries are the greatest source of water pollution.
So industries, for the most part, are more regulated than other urban sectors. There's no one stopping you from going and dumping 1,000 pounds of nitrogen on your front yard trying to make everything look green. And the stormwater in those areas, urban households and industrial facilities, it all goes to the same place. I know most states exempt it, and it probably makes people mad to even talk about agriculture, but agricultural operations are a huge source of nutrient pollution as well. So it's not necessarily pointing at an industrial facility and saying, hey, there's the polluter. It's looking at anywhere with impervious surfaces. If you live in an area with a stormwater fee or a stormwater tax, then you know what I'm talking about, because you get a bill, bi-monthly, monthly, whatever, that shows your impervious surface calculation and how much you're paying for stormwater, handling and pollutant mitigation.
Okay. So next myth, well, this is less of a myth and more of just kind of a, well, I'll just say it. So the state should just take care of all stormwater pollution.
Each state tries to in its own way, but this goes back to the Waters of the United States rule, some stuff we talked about earlier. Say you live on the border between Florida and Georgia, kind of like I am now. Where does the water go? Does stormwater pollution from Georgia stop at the border of Georgia, or does it flow into Florida, or does it vice versa? States try to regulate this to the extent they can. But again, our state boundaries generally weren't drawn following watersheds, surface water divides, groundwater basins. So these resources, water resources, are shared among states. And just saying the state will eventually take care of it, there's a million things that go into that. Are you okay with a tax to take care of that? The state needs more money to take care of it. So this has to be funded somehow. There's not just a magic wand you can wave and say, okay, we're going to take care of it this year, this election cycle. Our governor is going to end stormwater pollution.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And I get this, I have a Google alert set up for stormwater pollution and stormwater funding and all sorts of stuff. And I swear it's 3 times a week that I get a notification in my inbox that another city is trying to usually doesn't work, but they're trying to pass some sort of stormwater tax, and it's usually not that much. It would calculate to like $5 a year per individual and or per household sometimes, right? And even then, it usually just gets shut down. People get super frustrated about it.
Yeah, they do, and I think sometimes a lot of there's people are starting to get smarter about how they phrase these things because for a long time they were referred to as a stormwater tax or a rain tax, and there's always going to be a segment of the population that we say the word tax and their immediate response is to scream taxation is theft, and it doesn't matter what it's doing or what it's for. Those groups get a lot of traction sometimes, and as cities grow and as infrastructure ages, the city needs a way to raise more money to take care of things like that. And unless they're going to rely on citizen donations, a tax is usually the only way to do that.
Right.
And calculating impervious surfaces and averaging a cost across that is generally seen as the fairest way to do it.
Absolutely. So, second to last myth we got here is that stormwater pollution will eventually just go away.
It'll eventually go somewhere else. But no, as cities and urban areas expand, as we start revitalizing some older urban areas, we're growing as a country. So that means we're changing landscapes, we're introducing additional runoff. It's not ever just going to go away, but we're getting smarter about how we handle it. A lot of cities now, and I know the kind of the BMP inspection business has boomed lately because a lot of cities, I did a lot of work in Nashville recently, and we were installing bioretention systems anywhere and everywhere. Every new construction project, the stormwater control measure of choice was a bioretention system. There are whole industries that have sprang up in Nashville selling the bioretention, the fillable material and engineered fill. And it's great. They work. It's a way the city is helping not just put a big concrete treatment unit in there, but put in something that maintains the flow of the landscaping, keeps the property looking nice, and still provides some treatment value. So it's, like I said, it's not going to go away, but the cities and the counties and the states are doing things to mitigate pollution to the extent they can.
Yeah. All right. So the last myth we've got here is that no real stormwater solution exists to solve our pollution problem. You kind of addressed this in that last one there.
Yeah, there's a myriad of different devices, ways, and programs that are working to treat stormwater pollution. But no, it's not anything that's ever going to go away. And there's never going to be a one-stop fix for it all. So it's just making sure that when ordinances are enacted, that people follow them and that they're consistent across as much land as possible to ensure that you're treating a whole watershed the same way. So you can get quantifiable results and actually see some improvement.
Absolutely. And that's kind of our goal here, is to look for ways that we can find improvement and hopefully spread a little bit more interest about stormwater and education and environmental management, I guess, because it's a phrase that goes around on the compliance or the stormwater Twitter all the time, which is that this isn't one person's responsibility; it's everybody's responsibility. So, with that being said, we're right about at our end time. Is there anything you want to leave our viewers with, just before we go?
I've enjoyed this. I would definitely look forward to doing this again. But like we talked about earlier, all this is going to pass, and you're going to get back to work as usual. So make yourself as prepared as possible, and try not to get sick.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Preston. It was a blast.
It was a lot of fun. All right, stop the recording there, and then I'll stop my secondary recording.